It's the fourth largest country in the world by land area and the third largest by population, but it's hard to visualize the true enormity of the United States. While maps often focus on the contiguous states known as the Lower 48, a massive swath of land on its own, when you factor in the far-flung states of Alaska and Hawaii, along with numerous inhabited territories as well as desolate island possessions even further from the mainland, you're left with a picture of a country that spans the globe. It sits on two continents, takes up nearly 40% of North America's land, and has shores on three oceans. It stretches across both sides of the equator and the international dateline, and has land in both the tropics and the Arctic Circle. It's home to three of the five largest lakes on Earth, and though it has land borders with only two countries, it shares maritime borders with 23, including places as far apart as Russia and the Bahamas. In fact, you can travel 9,514 miles, or 15,311 kilometers, from Guam to the US Virgin Islands and still be within the same country. For comparison, you could go from New York City to nearly anywhere in the world except for Australia, and you'd still be closer than parts of the US are to each other. Even most of Antarctica is closer. Any country as large as the United States is going to be home to some truly incredible geographic diversity, but the sheer spread of it places landscapes that seem like different worlds to one another within the same country. Today, I'll be diving into the regional differences that make the US so unique, looking at their history, culture, and most importantly, their geography. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. Today, the first video in a two-part series on the vast regional differences of the United States, explained. This video is sponsored by Masterworks, an exciting company that I'll tell you more about later on. I've broken the US up into 13 regions, some large, some small. They're chosen based on having some amount of geographic and cultural cohesion with one another, but in a country this large, even these can be further divided and broken down into regions that are starkly different from one another in terms of their physical landscapes, history, and cultural identity. For example, the Eastern Shore of Virginia and the Cajun country of Louisiana are both included in my definition of the South, but both are very distinct from one another, as well as from other places in the South, such as Atlanta. Many of these regions are home to enormous percentages of the US population and take up vast swaths of land. So in breaking the country up this way, I'm not at all implying that these areas are completely or even mildly homogeneous to one another, only that they share some overarching similarities in geographic features and cultural identity. For example, I made a similar video to this looking at the regional diversity of California, and in that video divided the state into 9 distinct regions. In this video, the state is split between just 2. On top of that, dividing the country up into regions doesn't make it easy to depict overlap between regions that take up the same area. Because of this, there are other regions I would have liked to include on this map and could potentially put on other maps, but I didn't because they would overlap with other areas. A few places I couldn't work onto the map because of this are the Gulf Coast, the Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, the Ozarks, the East Coast, the Sun Belt, and the Rust Belt, just to name a few. Also, I don't want to discount state identity at all. Residents of most states have a strong sense of state identity, and some larger states like Texas, California, New York, and Florida seem to stand out culturally in a way that makes it hard to fit them cleanly into other regions. There were also some places like upstate New York that didn't seem to fit cleanly into any of the surrounding regions, but that weren't large and distinct enough to designate as their own region. So I made a choice with how I grouped them, but I could have probably put them with any one of their neighbors. I'm sure many of you will look at this map and disagree, and that's perfectly fine. I could have redrawn this 100 different ways because many of these are very fluid. Unsurprisingly, the edges of regions are transition zones between one and the other, and anywhere that's even kind of close to the borders I've drawn between the regions are places that you could probably consider part of both. With a map, though, I had to make a choice, so the regional borders should be taken as very broad areas of regional overlap and not as clear-cut divisions. The US is so large and there's so much to talk about, so I split the video into 2 parts. The second part will be up very soon, so make sure you go watch it when you're done. With all that said, let's get into the first one on the list, New England. New England has one of the strongest regional identities of any part of the country, shaped by a long and influential history, and it even has its own popular regional flag. It consists of 6 states, all among the smallest in the country by area, the sparsely populated and mostly rural states of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine in the north, and the densely populated and heavily urbanized states of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut in the south. Though the entirety of these states are often considered part of the region, I removed one county, Connecticut's Fairfield County, It's a suburban county of New York City and is often more closely aligned with its neighboring megacity than it is with the rest of the region, with many of its nearly 1 million residents commuting out of the state to New York. I also tried to not split up urban areas with this map, so it makes more sense to place Fairfield in the neighboring Mid-Atlantic. This gives New England a population of 14.16 million people, more than all but 4 states, but still fewer than most other regions on this list, and only 4.27% of the country's population. Nearly half of New Englanders live in the state of Massachusetts. I split urban areas up into 2 tiers, one with all urban areas with more than 1 million residents, and one with those home to between 500,000 and 1 million people. New England has 2 cities in this first tier, Boston and Providence. Boston is by far the region's powerhouse. It's the 10th largest urban area in the country and is part of, along with many of New England's cities, a large strand of urbanization called the Northeast Megalopolis that stretches down into D.C. and Northern Virginia. In the second tier are smaller cities like Hartford, Springfield, and New Haven. Most of the region's major cities are located within these smaller coastal states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and because of that, many are very close to one another, and their suburbs overlap. Geographically, it's home to rolling hills in the south and tall mountains that bring cold weather and make settlement difficult in the north. New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine are dominated by thick forests and tall mountains, and as such are sparsely populated, although their proximity to major cities like Boston makes them popular vacation destinations, along with beaches on the Massachusetts peninsula of Cape Cod and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. In the southern 3 states, rolling hills and flatter land make settlement easier, and the gently hilly topography, with the region lacking a real coastal plain, gives it excellent ports and harbors, and as such, cities and towns line the coast. Major rivers like the Connecticut formed fertile agricultural valleys, while others, such as the Blackstone and the Merrimack, became important early centers of milling and industry. The 6 states grew out of some of the earliest colonies to be settled by Europeans, and were shaped by a number of waves of settlement and immigration after most of their native people were killed or fled west. English religious groups such as the Puritans and Pilgrims founded colonies in the region that grew and merged into some of the states we know today, while Rhode Island was founded as a refuge from their stricter religious laws, and Vermont was an independent country born out of a border dispute that joined the U.S. after the Revolutionary War. It's one of the most historic parts of the country. Cities like Boston are filled with beautiful old buildings, and New England is famed for scenic towns and villages which dot the countryside, as well as popular hiking trails and ski resorts and lighthouses dotting the islands and cliffs of the coastline. The region has some of the strongest English influence in the country. Later waves of immigration continued to shape it, with Boston becoming the national destination of Irish immigration, Western Connecticut attracting Italians who came in through New York, and Portuguese immigrants flocking to Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. Bordering Quebec, the northernmost parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are dominated by French Canadians, many of whom still speak French at home. New England has the advantage of time. This was one of the first centers of colonial settlement in the country, and many of its residents are part of families that have been there for generations. There's plenty of old money and wealthy, leafy suburbs, more so than maybe anywhere else in this list. Though like anywhere else, there's poverty as well. Cities like Hartford have faced major issues with economic decline, and rural areas in the north of New Hampshire and Maine, geographically isolated and worlds away from other parts of New England, have faced issues as the logging industry has struggled. Massachusetts is the second wealthiest state in the country by per capita income, and Connecticut and New Hampshire are both within the top 10, though Rhode Island and Vermont are more towards the middle, and Maine is on the lower end of state income rankings. It's famed for having some of the most elite colleges and universities in the country, home to places like Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, and MIT, just to name a few, and its residents have played an outsized role in politics, literature, arts, and history. It's home to distinct accents like the Boston accent, and seafood is very popular in a region home to a huge fishing industry, known for regional foods like clam chowder and lobster rolls. It's generally more politically liberal and is unique for having the lowest rates of religiosity and church attendance in the country, though some of the highest populations of Catholics due to immigration from majority Catholic countries. I'm just glossing over these regions, but if you want a more in-depth look at any of them, I'm nearly halfway through a much more detailed series on each state, territory, and federal district in the country, called the U.S. Explained, and I've made longer form videos on many of them already. The next region I'll discuss is the country's financial, political, and population powerhouse. The Mid-Atlantic is relatively quite small. It could fit comfortably into most other U.S. states, but it's home to 13% of all Americans, 43.16 million people. On this map, I define it as extending from New York City up into the Hudson Valley of New York, including Connecticut's Fairfield County, encompassing the entirety of New Jersey and Delaware, the heavily populated eastern part of Pennsylvania, most of Maryland except the mountainous sections, as well as Washington, D.C. and its suburbs in northern Virginia. The cities I've included in the Mid-Atlantic's first tier include the largest and fifth largest urban areas in the entire country, New York City and Philadelphia, as well as Washington, D.C., the country's capital, and Baltimore, the largest city in Maryland. In the second tier are smaller cities like Bridgeport, Allentown, and Albany. This is the rest of the Northeast megalopolis outside of New England, and you'll often hear the two grouped together as simply the Northeast. Foothills of the Appalachians and their subranges like the Catskills sit on the region's fringes, but for the most part it's flat land sitting not far from the coast. Besides a few areas like the Pine Barrens of New Jersey and Maryland's swampy eastern shore, most of the region is flat, fertile, and easy to settle, with large rivers winding through it, and the fall line between the Appalachian foothills and the Atlantic coastal plain, allowing for industry to develop along the rivers, and excellent natural ports opening cities up to trade on the Atlantic of industrial and agricultural goods produced further inland. Because of these geographic advantages, and because this was one of the first parts of the country to be colonized by Europe, it quickly became the country's population center. Some of the first colonies in the region were Swedish and Dutch, but they eventually fell to British control as Britain didn't want other imperial powers controlling land between their colonies in New England and Virginia. As British settlers moved to the coastal colonies, they grew in population and importance. Philadelphia grew into the largest city in the colonies, and New York and Baltimore were major population centers as well. Later waves of immigrants poured in through New York's Ellis Island, and today it remains one of the most popular destinations for immigrants in one of, if not the most diverse cities in the world. Irish, Germans, Italians, as well as Poles and Russians, many of whom were Jewish refugees, entered through New York and moved throughout the Mid-Atlantic. Today, New York is far and away the center of America's Jewish community, the country with either the largest or second largest Jewish population on earth, depending on how you look at it. Black Americans from the South, fleeing racial discrimination, moved north and built a new life in the Mid-Atlantic cities like Washington, Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Newark, and New York. And migrants from Puerto Rico, as well as immigrants from the Dominican Republic and other parts of the Caribbean, came to New York City, where they've played an important role in shaping the city's history and culture. Altogether, this makes the Mid-Atlantic a place of strong racial and cultural diversity. Philly was a center of resistance in the American Revolution, and today is, along with Boston, one of the most historically significant major cities in the country. The Constitutional Convention was held there, and both the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were written in the city. The most important city in the country for a long time, it became one of the country's early capital cities, and today is still one of the largest cities in the United States. Its replacement, Washington, D.C., sits within the Mid-Atlantic as well. The planned city encompasses its own federal district, but suburbs in neighboring Maryland and Virginia make it the center of one of the largest urban areas in the country. It's in many ways a contradiction, home to many people struggling with poverty, while at the same time its suburbs are home to the first, second, and fifth wealthiest counties in the entire country, with high-paying government jobs, as well as lobbyists and contractors, creating a high-earning economy that revolves around the huge task of operating the federal government and all the branches of its bureaucracy. The few square miles home to the White House, Capitol, Supreme Court, federal departments, and the Pentagon is perhaps the most powerful stretch of land on Earth. At the same time, many of its residents are working-class citizens who lack voting representation in Congress due to the status of Washington as a federal district. DC's suburbs stretch into Maryland and Virginia, overlapping with those of Baltimore, an important port city in the Chesapeake Bay that has in recent years faced issues with poverty and crime. Not far from Baltimore sits Wilmington, Delaware, a smaller city in the Delaware River within Philadelphia's orbit. The suburbs of Philly on the other side bleed into Trenton, New Jersey's capital, which along with cities like Princeton, Edison, and New Brunswick form a string of urbanization connecting it to New York. The suburbs of New York across the Hudson in northern New Jersey are the most urbanized suburbs in the entire country and are home to densely populated residential areas, urban centers with tall skylines like Jersey City and Newark, and would be an enormous city in its own right even if Manhattan wasn't there. They, along with the suburbs of Philadelphia and the heavily urbanized Jersey Shore, home to places like Atlantic City, contribute to making the tiny state one of the most populous in the country, as well as giving it the highest population density. The Mid-Atlantic wouldn't be nearly what it is without New York City. The largest city in the country, it dominates the eastern seaboard and remains one of the global capitals of finance, insurance, and trade, home to two enormous stock exchanges, the headquarters of massive banks and financial institutions, and a center of global media, all of which have allowed it to build one of the most impressive skylines on Earth. Its cultural relevance is hard to overstate, and a city built by immigration, its countless neighborhoods remain distinct and unique today. The city grew as trade systems such as the Hudson River and Erie Canal linked it to the resource-rich hinterlands of the growing country, allowing it to ship out crops, textiles, and manufactured goods from one of the best natural harbors in the East Coast. And today, over 18 million people live in the megacity or in its heavily urbanized suburbs. It's home to both wealth and poverty. Washington, D.C., Maryland, and New Jersey are all among the 5 wealthiest places in the United States, but these statistics, bolstered by the fact that some of the wealthiest and most powerful people call the Mid-Atlantic home, conceal the great poverty that many of its residents live in. Cities like Baltimore, Camden, Bridgeport, and Trenton face serious problems with poverty, crime, and economic decline. Altogether, this region is defined by its urbanization. It's the most densely populated part of the country, and it's possible to drive from Alexandria, Virginia, up through Bridgeport, Connecticut, and through New England all the way into Boston and New Hampshire without ever having really left an urbanized area, something that it's hard to find anywhere else in the country.
I've talked a lot about economics in this video, which ties it in perfectly with today's sponsor. While all these regional differences create such varied economic conditions, it's still been a historically tough year across the entire country. Now, household debt is soaring at its fastest pace in 15 years, amid record inflation. But there are still investments that can help preserve wealth during these times of crisis, like one that's predicted to hit record levels this year: fine art. I know, it's surprising to hear, but Morgan Stanley says that investment-grade art has a very low correlation to other investments. UBS says art imports and exports should hit record highs this year, contrasting markets that are hitting historic lows. That's why I think what Masterworks is doing is fascinating. For the past 3 years, they've used fine art to hand back real results to their investors by filing multi-million-dollar paintings with the SEC and splitting them into shares. Masterworks doesn't do crypto or NFTs. These are Picassos and Banksys. All filings for Masterworks paintings are linked in the description and at sec.gov. Masterworks just handed back a 13.9% net return to their investors last month. That brings them to 9 exits, 4 of them in just the last 3 months. Those 4 sales returned 13, 17, 21, and 33% net. It's no wonder Masterworks paintings have sold out in minutes. But you can get priority access right away by clicking the link in the description.
The next region I've defined is Appalachia. Some people pronounce it Appalachia. You'll hear that pronunciation more in the south, while my pronunciation is more common in the northern part of the region. Just another example of how regions and regional identity have a lot of overlap, and there aren't clear-cut boundaries and totally unified identities within them. I have the region including much of the Appalachian Mountains and their foothills in nearby plateaus. I have it stretching from northern Georgia and Alabama, including the city of Huntsville, up through the mountainous parts of Tennessee and North Carolina, including cities like Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Asheville, through eastern Kentucky, including Lexington, the mountains of Virginia, with cities like Lynchburg and Roanoke, the entirety of West Virginia, the mountainous panhandle of Maryland, the hilly area of southeastern Ohio along the Ohio River, most of western and central Pennsylvania, and upstate New York apart from the Hudson Valley. Upstate New York is probably a controversial addition, as most of it isn't ever really considered part of Appalachia apart from the southern tier near the Pennsylvania border. However, it didn't make sense to include it in New England, nor did throwing it in the mid-Atlantic make any sense. Though it isn't viewed as Appalachian, it made the most sense to me to group it with it, as it's part of the Rust Belt, which shares a lot of overlap with Appalachia in terms of land, culture, and economy, and it has a working class identity and industrial history that gives it a lot of commonality with the region. Appalachia is home to 23.31 million people, or 7.02% of the country. It has 1 city in the first tier, the former manufacturing giant of Pittsburgh, and 3 in the second tier, Buffalo, Rochester, and Knoxville. Its mountainous topography made it much more rural and difficult to settle than neighboring regions, though cities and towns grew tucked into tight valleys and canyons and sprawling over hills and mountains. This has given Appalachia a degree of isolation from the East Coast, and has allowed it to develop a very different identity and culture, rooted more in the values of the working class and the region's many small industrial towns. It's a place where people stay for generations, where they know their neighbors and communities and are close and tight-knit. At the same time, it's fallen victim to a rise in automation and the exporting of industrial jobs to cheaper and less regulated areas overseas, where labor conditions are often brutal and inhumane. Job loss has devastated entire towns and cities. The closure of a factory, which might have been the lifeblood of a large chunk of residents, leaves them unemployed and unable to afford to spend money in local businesses, creating a ripple effect which can be the death knell for entire towns. This affects quality of life across the board. Poverty rates are some of the highest in the country, especially in more rural areas like West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. And pharmaceutical giants have exploited the region, pumping in opioids and fueling a crisis which has devastated the people of Appalachia and other parts of the Rust Belt, many of whom are already dealing with lingering health problems from the dangers of mining and manufacturing jobs, whose decline has caused devastation across the region. Many people who can are leaving. The populations of many Appalachian states have either been stagnant or shrinking over the last few decades. The rise of the Sun Belt fueled by in-country migration from the Rust Belt. Throughout the country, you'll find plenty of people who have connections to states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. Despite its challenges, the people have been incredibly resilient, and there's still a great pride in being from Appalachia and a strong sense of community that holds it together. Once the physical fringe of the early United States, its success powered the growth and development of the country. Filled with coal, oil, and natural gas, it became an industrial powerhouse. The steel that brought the country into the 20th century was produced in Pittsburgh, the grain to feed a growing population milled in upstate New York, and the coal to keep the power on mined in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. If the Mid-Atlantic was the successful face the United States showed to the world, it was Appalachia that kept the country on its feet, creating the goods that power the country's economic growth, the fuel to keep its lights on, and the materials for the skyscrapers displayed as a symbol of its success. Immigrants came to the region to work these industrial jobs. In the north were Germans, later came Poles and other Eastern Europeans. In the south, many were descendants of immigrants and settlers from the British Isles, English, Scottish, Irish, and Scots-Irish. The southern part was less industrialized. The mountainous land was generally cheaper and harder to farm, leading poorer people to move there. Despite often being on the receiving end of a condescending misconception that the region's problems are the result of a natural push towards progress and that residents are just refusing to accept that times are changing, the region's residents have continued to push for recognition of their challenges, and in some areas, things are getting better. Pittsburgh has been able to rebound somewhat, diversifying its economy and seeing its population begin to recover. In the once economically weaker southern part of Appalachia, government investments have led to diversified economies as well, such as the hydroelectric industry in Knoxville and the space industry in Huntsville, and tourism and recreation have grown prominent in places like North Carolina and Tennessee. At the same time, areas like eastern Kentucky and West Virginia are still among the poorest parts of the United States. Appalachia is a place with a strong regional identity and an essential role in the country both historically and today, and I'm proud to be from there myself. What Appalachia is to industry, the Midwest is to agriculture. The huge region is often geographically similar across the board, dominated by flat, fertile farmland. The glaciers that carved out the Great Lakes smoothed and flattened the part of the country sitting to the south and west of them, depositing rich soil that made it ripe for agricultural production. This also gives the Midwest a huge population. A house, town, or city can be built on practically any part of it, and even its rural areas have a larger baseline population than much of the country. Often dubbed flyover country by those unfamiliar with it and its distinctions, farmland does dominate the region, and much of it is a monoculture. Corn and soybeans make up 75% of all the region's cropland, often used to create feed for livestock. However, its cities, many of which sit on the Great Lakes or important waterways like the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, have distinct identities, industries, and things to do. It's also far from solely farmland. The northern halves of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota are part of an enormous boreal forest that stretches south from Canada, whose cold weather and poor soil creates an area of sparsely populated wilderness that's hard to find elsewhere in the region. The driftless area, split between Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois, is a hilly and forested area that was missed by glaciation, and southern Indiana is dominated by beautiful hilly scenery. Islands fill the Great Lakes, such as the Apostle Islands, Mackinac Island, and the scenic and remote national park of Isle Royale. Vast stretches of sand dunes, like the Indiana Dunes and Sleeping Bear Dunes, line Lake Michigan, and northern Minnesota as well as the upper peninsula of Michigan are filled with small mountains and lakeside cliffs that give them some of the most beautiful scenery in the country. Easy to settle and agriculturally dominant, it's home to an enormous population, 65.36 million people in total, or 19.69% of all Americans. In my map, I include the entirety of Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, as well as most of Ohio, all but the southern tip of Illinois, the northern half of Missouri, the northern tip of Kentucky, home to Louisville and the Cincinnati suburbs, and the eastern thirds of the Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska, where most of the state's residents reside. The defining feature of the region is agriculture. It's what drives many people's livelihoods and what dominates its geographic scenery. As it moves into the Great Plains, the land becomes more arid and less fertile, and less able to sustain the same kinds of crops, whereas the Great Lakes form a natural barrier to the north and to the east and south. Appalachia in the south are hillier and more forested. Similar to Appalachia, it has a small town working class culture, and residents are known for being friendly and cheerful. Besides Chicago, its large cities feel less cosmopolitan than they do on the coasts, and even in parts of the South and Mountain West. There's far less tourism, and many people are moving away, so locals who have stayed there often have deep connections to their communities. It's home to a number of major cities. In the first tier is Chicago, by far the region's largest, the third largest in the country, and the only American city with a skyline and urban feel to rival New York. Also in the first tier is automotive giant Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, and Columbus, as well as many smaller cities in the second tier such as Louisville, Omaha, Dayton, Grand Rapids, Akron, and Toledo. This heavy urbanization puts Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan all in the 10 most populous states in the country. While rural areas were big in agriculture, the Great Lakes cities of the Midwest were industrial giants just like Appalachia, making much of it a part of the Rust Belt. They each had specialties: oil in Cleveland, automobiles in Detroit, grain in Minneapolis, brewing in Milwaukee, consumer goods in Cincinnati, and so on. It was an extension of America's industrial heartland, and its breadbasket on top of that. Just like Appalachia, the United States could not have become the highly developed powerhouse it is today without the Midwest. Immigrants flocked there seeking cheap land to farm and make a living. Germans moved west from Pennsylvania and remained the largest ancestry group in every Midwestern state and the U.S. as a whole. Poles and other Eastern Europeans came to the Great Lakes states like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois, while colder and more remote agriculture areas like Minnesota, Iowa, and the Dakotas became a destination for Norwegians, Swedes, and other Scandinavian immigrants, while Dutch immigrants carved out communities in Michigan. The impact of these different groups is still seen in the regional foods, traditions, and accents, a wide range of which exist from Minnesota and the Dakotas all the way to Ohio and Kentucky. Trade in the Great Lakes connected the Mississippi River to the East Coast, which, on top of its many natural resources and agricultural potential, set the stage for its economic success and population growth. Chicago became the enormous city it is today because it sat right on the closest point that the watershed of the Mississippi River came to the Great Lakes, making it an essential conduit for trade and transport of goods produced in the Midwest. The Great Migration saw Black Americans from the South move north during the beginning of the 20th century, to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Indianapolis, looking for jobs in the industrial cities of the Midwest and giving the region a large black population, which has contributed greatly to their history, culture, and growth. Like many of these regions, it's an economic mixed bag. The cost of living is generally lower, homes and goods are often much more affordable than on the coasts, and suburbs of cities like Minneapolis and Chicago are quite well off. Chicago, its cosmopolitan urban core, is a lively and exciting city home to some of the tallest buildings in the world and beautiful parks and monuments stretching across the lakeshore. At the same time, parts of the city are plagued by poverty and violence, as well as some of the worst de facto segregation seen in the country, and a problem seen across Midwestern cities like Minneapolis and Detroit as well. Detroit, for its part, was long an automotive titan, but the decline of industry hit it harder than perhaps anywhere else, and the city famously filed for bankruptcy in 2013. Cleveland, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and smaller cities like Akron and Toledo have all faced similar problems, and poverty, crime, and economic decline are major issues. Smaller cities like Fargo, Sioux Falls, Lincoln, Omaha, and Wichita form a cutoff line near the edge of the Midwest as the soil becomes drier and the fertile landscape transitions to the more sparsely populated Great Plains. The largest of these, Omaha, was a major railroad hub as the country pushed westward. An enormous center of population, agriculture, and industry, the United States would not be what it is today without the Midwest, and though it's often glossed over, its friendly people, strong sense of community, and beautiful landscapes make it a great place to call home. I should know, it's where I live today. Directly to the south of the Midwest is the South, a region that occupies a huge role in the American popular imagination. It's one of the largest regions I've drawn and the most populous, home to a stunning 75.52 million people, or 22.75% of all Americans. I've included in it the entirety of the states of Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, most of Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, the western halves of Kentucky and Tennessee, the northern half of Florida, the eastern extremes of Texas and Oklahoma, the southern half of Missouri, and the southern tip of Illinois. Largely flat, fertile land with plenty of water has given the region a huge population, especially in cities where the foothills of the Appalachians meet flatter coastal plains, and waterfalls create mills and industry. The largest river in the country, the Mississippi, slices through it, and its warm weather and growing economy have made it a desirable place to live in recent decades, giving it a rapidly increasing population. It has a number of cities in the first tier, such as Houston, Atlanta, Tampa, Orlando, Virginia Beach, Charlotte, Jacksonville, and Memphis, and many in the second tier as well, such as Nashville, Richmond, New Orleans, Raleigh, Birmingham, Baton Rouge, Columbia, and Charleston. Its geography has shaped its history, culture, and the problems it's faced. Before the Midwest, the South was the agricultural heart of the United States. Its warm climate and flatter, more fertile landscape allowed it to become an agricultural producer, while the northern coastal colonies and later states could not. However, a swampy coastline dominated by marshes, barrier islands, and dangerous sandbanks made the development of good ports more difficult, though some like New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah did develop. For the most part, though, the goods they produced were shipped out through cities like New York. The early colonists were dominated by elite landowners from England who came not to flee religious persecution, but to take advantage of the wealth the continent had to offer. These wealthy landowners maintained power of both their massive plantations as well as the political system of these states by creating a permanent underclass. People from Africa were forcibly taken captive and shipped to the South in a deadly trade. Those that survived were sold into slavery, where they faced abuse, murder, and brutal forced and unpaid labor to which they could not leave, harvesting the tobacco and cotton that made plantation owners so rich. The sheer number of enslaved Africans brought to the South meant that in many southern states, their descendants were the majority of the population. But they were held captive both by physical violence and laws which prevented them from participating politically, speaking freely, or learning to read. The plantation elite maintained control as well by convincing the many poor and working class white Southerners, mostly descendants of poor Irish, Scottish, English, and Scots-Irish immigrants, that simply due to the color of their skin they were superior, scapegoating black people as the enemy and justifying it through the creation of a disgusting white supremacist ideology, which would long outlive slavery and fuel racism and racial segregation both in the South and across the country for centuries to come. It was the South's refusal to give up slavery, an institution that it had become almost singularly dependent on economically, which led to tensions with a North that could no longer abide with such a moral outrage. This tension boiled over into the Civil War, the most devastating war in American history, and a conflict largely fought in the South. It saw towns and cities turned to rubble, and hundreds of thousands killed. Some Southerners still maintain an unfortunate nostalgia for the Confederacy, overlooking if not embracing the terrible reasons why the war was fought. After the war's end, the ideology which allowed slavery to exist remained institutionalized in Jim Crow laws that were one of the darkest chapters in the country's history. I don't want to seem like I'm pinning all the blame on the South. The rest of the U.S. was hardly innocent as well, something that often gets lost when remembering this part of history. Black Southerners resisted Jim Crow. The civil rights movement, which pushed for an end to segregation in Jim Crow, was largely based out of the South and saw activists fight for decades at great personal risk for basic freedoms and human dignity to be respected. Some of the country's greatest and most well-respected leaders came out of this fight for freedom. And economic dependence on agriculture also meant that the South was far less developed than the now industrialized North, and had a lot of catching up to do. But in the last half-century, the story of a region marked by tragedy and poverty has largely been one of success. The region has diversified its economy. Oil extraction and refining boomed in Texas and Louisiana, banking in Charlotte, manufacturing in Birmingham, and tourism in Florida and all along the coasts. The crown jewel of this growth has been Atlanta, which has grown as one of the largest cities in the country, with the world's busiest airport, a thriving technology industry, and growth as a cultural center for the region that's seen a booming music, film, and entertainment industry. The South, along with the West, has seen the sharpest population growth in the country in recent decades, turning it into the country's most populous region. Emblematic of this growth is the fact that the region has seen a reverse Great Migration. Black Americans from the North, many descendants of people who migrated there from the South 100 years ago, are moving to fast-growing southern cities, to a region that is still home to the largest black community in the country, both across urban and rural areas. Though there's a shared southern identity, a culture of politeness and formality, a range of accents that are distinct but share common threads, delicious and distinct cuisine, and a general bend of political and social conservatism related to the highest rates of religiosity and church attendance in the country, it's also far from homogenous. Cultural enclaves like the Cajun country of Louisiana, New Orleans, the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, home to the Geechee and Gullah people, and isolated islands like the Outer Banks and Tangier Island are some of the most culturally unique places in the country. The South's recent success is not to say there aren't troubles socially or economically. While places like Georgia and North Carolina are growing and prospering, places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas remain among the 5 poorest states in the country. Regions like the agricultural Mississippi Delta struggle especially. Shaped by a devastating history, and though it's not without its problems, the South is today fast-growing, exciting, and successful, and held together by a rich culture, strong sense of regional identity and community, and a promising economy. It's widely considered one of the best places to live in the country. That's it for part 1. We've gone over most of the eastern half of the United States, and in part 2, we'll explore the fascinating geographic and cultural differences of the western US, as well as the far-flung states and territories beyond the lower 48. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll really enjoy part 2, so make sure you go give it a watch. On top of that, if you wished I'd gone more in depth on specific places in this video, I have good news for you. I'm nearly halfway through a 56-part series providing an in-depth analysis in every state, territory, and federal district in the country. It's called the US Explained, and if you like this video, it'll be right up your alley. I'm also considering turning this video into a series. I've already made a regional breakdown of California, and there are a few other states with major regional differences, as well as other large countries like Canada, Australia, China, Russia, Brazil, and so on, that could be really interesting to explore. So if you'd like to see these regional breakdown videos become an ongoing series, please leave a comment and let me know. And remember to click the link in the description to get priority access to Masterworks. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as behind-the-scenes videos, early access to maps I create, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, ad-free content, and shout-outs to my videos. Please be sure to check out the TII store, where you'll be able to purchase all sorts of official That Is Interesting products and merchandise, including shirts, hoodies, embroidered beanies, masks, mugs, embroidered backpacks, laptop stickers and sleeves, and so on. I really appreciate the well over 700 of you who have already joined my Discord server. If you haven't joined the Discord server yet, it's a great place to continue conversations about the topics discussed in these videos, interact with fellow viewers, and help provide information and suggestions for future videos. It's a great community, and we do fun stuff like geography game nights, live podcasts, and so on. I'll put links to both the Patreon and the Discord in the comments. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.